My name is Cass C.C. Walrath, and this is my research defense for the Capstone Seminar for Fall 2025. My research paper is titled In Her Hand and Name, Gender, Economic Authority, and Domestic Governance in 18th-Century Scotland, 1740 to 1790. What first led me to this topic was my family name. I grew up with the Campbell name, but not a clear sense of women who shaped that history. When I began graduate study in 2024, my personal curiosity led me into the world of elite Scottish women. Once I reached the archives later that summer and encountered the surviving letters of Grace Campbell, the personal thread fell away. The correspondence raised larger questions about women's economic authority, emotional labor, and the work required to manage an 18th century household. Those questions served as a basis for this study. Before turning to the evidence, I want to begin with the central argument. My thesis is that Lady Grace Campbell transformed the emotional labor of care, judgment, and household management into a practical form of governance. Her writing shows that elite women exercise economic and cultural authority from within the household, even while operating inside legal structures that limited their formal rights. 3 questions guide this study. First, how did Grace use emotion to influence decisions within her marriage and household? Second, how did her letters function as administrative tools that shaped choices about money, property, and reputation? And third, what do these documents reveal about the expectations placed on elite Scottish women during the middle decades of the 18th century? I will begin with how I encountered the letters and how my interpretation of them shifted. I will then outline the methods I used during my archival work, walk through a brief chronology of key documents, and present the core argument. I will situate my findings within the broader historiography on gender law and household economy, and end with a reflection on what I learned during this process. I first encountered Grace Campbell's letters in the summer of 2024 at Inverary Castle. Near the end of my visit, the archivist, Alison Diamond, handed me a small bundle marked miscellaneous. She noted that someone had taken an interest in them in years earlier. I later learned that this was historian Marion Pallister, whose 2018 article first treated them as curiosities. A few of the letters had partial transcriptions, so I skimmed them during that trip. I expected to find simple family notes, affectionate updates, domestic details, fragments of personal life rather than the material that could carry an argument. On that first reading, they appeared exactly as they did. I also did not realize yet that the archive preserves only Grace's letters. None of her husband John's replies survive. Without his voice, her longing felt disproportionate, and I misread the tone of the correspondence. That early interpretation shaped my History 500 prospectus in fall 2024, which leaned towards social history and the emotional texture of elite women's lives. During the fall, when I was TAing for Dr. Stephen Laser, we discussed marital correspondence, and he recommended that I read Stephen Osment's Magdalena and Balthazar. Osment treats marital letters as documents of work, records of negotiation, household management, judgment, and partnership. And returning to Grace's letters with that framework in mind changed everything. The absence of John's letters no longer weakened the argument. It intensified it. What looked like longing also contained instructions, calculations, cautions, and decisions. And leading up to the 2025 Summer Archive Experience conversations with Dr. Cole and Dr. Dupé, well, they helped me see the structure that was beginning to emerge. And when I looked closely at her judgment, her attention to money and kin, the way she managed travel and reputation, the letters shifted from personal fragments to evidence of labor, emotional, economic, and administrative. That interpretive shift became the foundation of my study. Once I recognized the potential of the letters, I refined my archival strategy. I mapped out which collections I needed to consult, selected the primary and secondary sources most relevant to my new framework, and plan the trip day by day. In July 2025, I returned to the Argyll State Archives in Inverary for a second trip and a systematic review. I photographed each letter, placed them in chronological order in a spreadsheet, and recorded detailed notes on the elements that shaped household management: money, illness, travel, kinship, reputation. I also examined a 1749 pre-marriage conditions contract, which helped me connect her earliest private letters within the legal structure created around her marriage. From there, I worked across several Scottish archives. At the National Library of Scotland, I studied a 1752 instrument of seisin, a property deed, which placed property in her name and offered a legal counterpoint to her domestic writing. And at the National Records in Scotland, I examined a 1785 seisin that transferred those rights entirely to her husband following her death, as well as a 1781 luxury textile bill that speaks to her role in refinement and household display. And at the Royal College of Surgeons and University of Glasgow archives, I reviewed medical consultation letters from the Colon Project that illuminate the final decade of her life. And through correspondence with the archivist at the Mount Stewart Trust on Bute, I obtained scans of John Campbell's estate and administrative correspondence, which helped contextualize the economic world in which Grace operated. Working across those collections allowed me to read the letters not as isolated emotional documents, but as a part of a broader administrative system. When set beside contracts, saisins, bills, medical consultations, her correspondence reveals a consistent pattern of labor, financial vigilance, logistical planning, and the daily work of maintaining household stability and reputation. To give a sense of this study's chronological shape, I want to outline key moments in Grace Campbell's life as they appear in the archive. So she was born in 1722 at Rothesay Castle in the Isle of Bute into the Stewart family, and she was tied to property, law, and clan politics. And the first major document in the study is the 1749 pre-marriage settlement that was drafted entirely by male relatives. Her absence reveals the structural limits on women's legal authority. And so her surviving letters, they begin that same year, and they show her blending affection with practical judgment. And Grace married John Campbell in 1750, and her responsibilities widened then as she became the manager of the Campbell estate. And in 1751, in a letter written from Halkhead while she was pregnant, she balances emotional vulnerability with clear financial reasoning. The 1752 instrument of seisin placed property in her name, giving a rare legal acknowledgement to her position. And then there's correspondence from the 1750s and the early 1760s, including a letter about foodstuffs, venison and calf. And it reveals how food, gifts, and obligations functioned as forms of economic and social capital. And by the 1770s, illness had shaped much of the household's life. And medical correspondence shows her coordinating treatment, managing servants. And a 1781 luxury textile bill documents her role in shaping the household's material world. And then Grace died in 1783. But 2 years later, a final seisin recorded solely in her husband's name erased her earlier legal presence, closing that same arc that began with the 1749 marriage settlement. And this structure provides the context for my argument. 3 patterns stood out when I examined the letters and the legal documents together. First, Grace used emotion deliberately. Her expressions of affection, worry, frustration usually appeared just before a request or a warning, and her tone framed what she needed, allowing motion to guide household decisions. Second, the letters contain extensive administrative work. She tracked accounts, compared property costs, supervised servants, reported on kin, managed reputation. These were not side details. They form the backbone of her correspondence and reveal ongoing management. And third, her authority becomes visible only when the letters are placed beside the legal records. The law limited her rights. The marriage articles excluded her signature. The saisins recorded what she could hold and then removed her. But the letters show how she worked within that system. And it showed how she shaped her decisions about money, care, movement, social standing. Her emotional and economic labor were intertwined, and in short, her authority did not come from formal legal rights. It emerged from the daily work she carried out through her writing. To understand where this study fits, I examine how historians have written about women's power, emotion, and daily life in the last 3 decades. Scholars like Toby Dietz and Rebecca Earle in the 1990s showed that letters shaped identity and relationships. And in the early 2000s, Stan and Anatic Carolyn Steedman and Catherine Glover demonstrated how literacy, politeness, and everyday writing created forms of influence. In the 2010s, Katie Barclay and Rosalind Carr connected emotion to power and highlighted the contradictions of Enlightenment Scotland. And more recent work by Rebecca Mason and Joanne Beggiato links emotion, law, and household authority even more directly. And then there's Miriam Pallister's 2018 article, which introduced Grace Campbell's letters, but focused mainly on their value to social history. Well, my study builds on this work by bringing together cultural and economic history. I read tone, emotion, self-preservation alongside financial, legal, and administrative detail. Rather than treating these as separate domains, I argue that they operated together in Grace Campbell's life. Her emotional expression, financial management, and legal position formed a single system through which she exercised authority. What stood out to me as I completed this study is how much authority can hide in places where the archive does not expect to find it. And Grace Campbell's letters show that emotional writing, practical judgment, and economic management are inseparable in the daily life of an 18th century household. Working with this material has taught me how to read between the lines of a partial archive and to recognize forms of power that rarely appear in formal records. And more broadly, it reminded me that women's voice often survives in fragments. Yet, those fragments can reshape how we understand law, labor, and family life. And if I had more time on this project, I would have traveled in person to Mount Stewart on the Isle of Bute to visit the archive. I would have also tried more diligently to connect with some of the authors of my secondary sources. This work has changed the way I approach the archive, and I will carry that perspective forward in my historical practice.